I want to speak to you about our right and our responsibility to vote. The premise for what I'm going to say is Pastor Adele Khan's acrostic definition of vote, a vehicle of transformation and empowerment. The proposition that I'm making in the time we're sharing together is that ability to vote as an African American citizen of the United States is a hard-fought and precarious right imposing on all who qualify an incumbent responsibility to protect that right and to exercise it to the fullest extent possible. These are my points. They're in the proposition. The right is hard-fought, growing out of the limitations on the right of suffrage, understood as the elective franchise or citizenship stake in the country, established at the beginning of the Republic. The right to vote was extended first to freeholding male property owners. Freeholding means that slaves, male means that women, and property owners means that non-property owners were excluded from the right to vote. Slaves, women, and non-property owning freemen were excluded from the right to vote. Ironically, and that's significant right now because we are in the midst of another census, all of the latter, women, men, and slaves, were included in the census for the purpose of distributing representation among the states in congressional districts. And we remember this, that the way slaves were counted was particularly dehumanizing, because that's where we get the 3/5 formula, where we often say that the Constitution in this particular provision considers black people, African Americans, to be 3/5 human. Actually, it was a formula whereby every 5 slaves was counted as 3 persons in the census in order for the people who held slaves and for the states that were slaveholding states to have more representation in the Congress so that they could fight for and preserve their way of life. So slaves were being counted against their very own interests. Over time, the vote was extended to the citizen freemen in the so-called Jacksonian Revolution, when Andrew Jackson was elected as President of the United States. He was among the first of the populist presidents of the nation, of the country, and he was supported by a group of freeholding citizens who were claiming their right to vote. We need to understand that the right of African Americans to vote came through the cataclysm of the Civil War. The Civil War, which was fought because the nation reached a point at which, as Abraham Lincoln said, it could not continue to exist half slave and half free, and where the agitation over slavery had reached a point that the southern states began to consider and eventually to act to withdraw from the Union and to establish their own nation as the Confederacy. So through the Civil War, which was finally won, because at a crucial time when the Union side was facing a lack of troops to fight the war, African American black soldiers were recruited and brought into the Union Army. And as Lincoln always said, acquitted themselves bravely. Because of that, he was prepared and he was an advocate for granting them the franchise. And when he said that in his address to the crowd outside the White House after his re-election, it is rumored that it was then that John Wilkes Booth and his group began to conspire to assassinate Lincoln because he was advocating the vote for the slaves, that he had already issued an Emancipation Proclamation, and which he intended to make into a constitutional provision. And they were determined that slaves should not have the right to vote, or what they called the franchise, that portion in having a stake in the government. So, 13th Amendment, which wrote into the Constitution the emancipation and the ending and abolishing of slavery within the United States, and the 14th Amendment, which established the right of citizenship and the equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment, which established the right to vote, were added to the Constitution. And these three amendments, although Lincoln was not alive when they were all finally passed, these three amendments brought into being what Lincoln meant in the Gettysburg Address when he called on the people who were there to resolve that those who had died on the battlefield at Gettysburg should not have died in vain, that the nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. This was Lincoln's new birth of freedom, meaning that the Revolution of 1776 and the Constitution of 1787 that resulted from that had not included people who must be included if the nation was going to be whole. And that was why he favored citizenship for freed slaves, which included the right to vote. 15th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is the official statement of our constitutional right to vote. The second part of that amendment says the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Unfortunately, the fight for racial equality in voting did not end with the ratification of the 15th Amendment. the Hayes Compromise, which took place after the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as president on the condition that he would withdraw the federal troops from the South. That brought an end to Reconstruction and the reestablishment of the Southern white hegemony that changed again the voting rolls, removed from the voting rolls those freed slaves who had begun to exercise that franchise, chased out of the Congress those African Americans, those black men who had been elected to the House of Representatives, and established what came into the 20th century as a whole set of provisions and means by which white supremacy, beginning at the ballot box, was established and maintained. They came up with matters like the poll tax, where you had to pay a tax in order to vote. And of course, the tax was always high enough that black people had trouble paying it, and if they could even be allowed to register. They came up with things like the white primary, which meant that the primary elections, whereby those who were in the final vote were determined and selected, only whites could vote in the primary. If blacks were allowed to vote at all, they had to vote on the candidates that whites had chosen according to their own interest. And so, well into the 20th century, we were still fighting and struggling to try to exercise our right. The 15th Amendment says so. The Constitution says so. We have a right to vote. That right has always been resisted and has always been suppressed by those who intend to retain power in order to advance their own interests at the expense of black people. That's why I say that our right to vote is precarious. Our right is precarious. It was won, hard fought, blood was shed. Blood was shed in the Civil War, in the first instance. And then, during the Civil Rights Movement, we saw recently, as we watched the services honoring John Lewis, how he stood on the bridge in 1965, fully 100 years after the 15th Amendment had been ratified. He was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge marching to Montgomery in order to declare and insist on the right of black people in Alabama, particularly in Selma, Alabama, to register and to vote. Hard fought, but precarious. 100 years later, that right had not been enforced by the Congress. In 1964, as part of the civil rights legislation, the Congress did vote an act. They passed an act to ban the poll tax, but that was just one of the barriers. There were many. One I would include in that is during the time that I was a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta in the 1950s, there was what was called the county unit rule in the state of Georgia, which meant that when the votes were counted in Georgia, all the votes in Atlanta added up to one vote, which would then be related to the votes of other counties, so that it was established that they could always outvote Atlanta, which was the most populous city in the state, and of course, the most progressive city in the state. They were afraid that if Atlanta was allowed to have the full voting power that their numbers represented, they'd exercise too much influence over politics in Georgia. And the election of 2018, in which Stacey Abrams ran as a candidate for governor, is evidence that the sentiments and the tactics that kept down, that suppressed the power of the black vote in that state are still present. It is a precarious right. It is not guaranteed just because it's in the Constitution. It has to be fought to be enforced. We've had setbacks. After 1965, after the Voting Rights Act was established and included enforcement provisions, one poison pill that was included in the Voting Rights Act in order for it to pass was a requirement that every so often it had to be brought back for consideration to be renewed and its provisions renewed. And the southern states in particular had insisted on that as a condition for them allowing the Voting Rights Act to pass, so that they could, after a period of time, roll back many of the gains that had been made in establishing that act. And we've seen it happen over the years. Every time the Voting Rights Act came up for renewal, there was a struggle, there was a fight, and it was renewed in the Clinton administration. It was renewed in the George W. Bush administration. And then, after the last time it was renewed, those who were at work behind the scenes, changing the personnel on the Supreme Court, finally got a court that took the enforcement teeth out of the civil rights, out of the Voting Rights Act, and allowed those states to proceed to establish new traditions, new requirements, new regulations on voting. And so we've gotten the ID laws, and we've gotten all of the kinds of barriers, the ways that the election rolls are being purged, and all of the kinds of barriers, all of the kinds of tactics that are used in order to suppress the vote. We have the right, but it's precarious. And so, having the right and facing the fact that it's precarious, it is incumbent on us. We have the responsibility. We have the responsibility to fight to protect that right. I have been reminded, and on reflection, I have been amazed at how John Lewis, fought so hard as a young man, 1965, still in his 20s, he suffered the brutal beating on the bridge, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Then, as a member of Congress, he was there for all of the fights, all of the struggles over renewal of the Voting Rights Act, and he watched as the people within the Congress and as members on the Supreme Court chipped away at the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. And by the time he died, we were in a situation where we must renew. We need a new Voting Rights Act in order to reestablish the kinds of enforcement that breaks down and prevents the voter suppression that we have faced since the Supreme Court had, in effect, repealed the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act. He saw all of that happen, but he was still there and still in the fight. And now the Congress is facing up to, and hopefully they will meet the challenge of passing a new Voting Rights Act. That act will bear the name of John Robert Lewis. We have a responsibility to protect the right that we are given that we have in the Constitution, our God-given right to be a part of the community, and written into the Constitution and won by blood and toil. We have the responsibility to protect that right and cause of the struggle which is continuing. We have a responsibility to exercise that right to the fullest extent possible. That's where we are today. We have an opportunity. We have an opportunity. Those of us who are here in Ohio are not facing as severe attempts, or efforts, or means of suppressing the vote as in some other places. But the Secretary of State of Ohio has just issued a charge that there shall be no places to deposit ballots other than at the Board of Elections. There used to be other drop boxes, removed all the drop boxes, and is ready to purge the rolls of maybe 200,000 people again. They'd already been purged in the last 2 to 4 years. So we are facing a great challenge. We must fight to protect, and by all means, we must use every bit of our energy in order to exercise that right. That right is not just an option. It's a responsibility. Faces us as a mandate. And it's up to us to do those things to secure the right that we have earned and won and given by virtue of struggle and the fact of our citizenship. It is derelict of duty if we fail to put ourselves on the rolls to register and to vote and to hold those whom we vote for or those who, even without our vote, occupy office accountable for the things that they do.